Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
That's right. Welcome to Morning Shot with Emaad, Akhtar and Audrey Siek. U.S. and Russian officials have just wrapped up day-long talks focused on a narrow proposal for a ceasefire at sea between Kyiv and Moscow, part of a diplomatic effort that Washington hopes will help pave the way for broader peace negotiations.
According to regional officials, as the talks continue, so did the attacks on Ukraine, where Russian strikes have killed at least 4 civilians in the last 24 hours. This follows U.S. President Donald Trump's phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, with the Russian leader only agreeing to halt attacks on energy infrastructure.
Putin had earlier said that a comprehensive truce could only work if foreign military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine came to an end. Such conditions were previously rejected by Ukraine's European allies. So will Ukraine eventually have any say at the negotiating table? For more insights on that, we're joined by Cynthia Hooper, Associate Professor and Russian and Eastern European Studies Program Advisor at the College of the Holy Cross. Cynthia, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. First off, your assessment of what went down during the high-stakes call, which some have called a test of Trump's touted deal-making skills, as well as of his prized relationship with the Russian leader. Should America's traditional allies be concerned right now?
Oh, I think they should be very concerned. The Russians are covering both the talk with Trump and these last 12 hours of negotiations very positively. There's a new way of presenting Trump in the Russian media that's very different from the way they covered him when he was first president from 2016 to 2020, where they often, mocked him and joked about him and presented him as somehow less competent than Vladimir Putin. This time around, the Russian media is making sure to present both men as very firm, very strong, very serious, as sort of the two grown-ups in the room. And they draw a stark contrast between sort of these sort of expert statesmen who can negotiate deals and Volodymyr Zelensky and Joseph Biden, who, they sort of mock for all kinds of different reasons. So the attitude in the state media is extremely positive.
All right, so definitely a switch in narrative there. And Trump has also hinted at some aspects that would make up a longer-term peace plan, and that includes territorial concessions by Kyiv and control of a nuclear power plant likely to factor into negotiations. How realistic is this plan, you think?
Well, Zelensky spoke out at the European Council meeting last week saying that there had been no such talks and that Ukraine's nuclear resources remained, Ukraine's property. But I think that there's a larger issue here. I expect that Putin is happy to encourage Trump to think about the lucrative deals that could possibly be done in Ukraine. There's obviously this minerals deal on the table that I think Putin could sort of, say that he's willing to encourage America to pursue, first of all, to sort of come across to Trump as being, a flexible negotiator, not adverse to certain forms of U.S. influence, but then also, happy to set sort of the stage for in the future there being kind of this picture of America, taking over or exploiting the state of Ukraine that remains after any kind of ceasefire.
Yeah, Cynthia, Trump has also brought up the idea of dividing up assets, including Ukrainian land, which on the surface sounds pretty controversial, as part of the conversation to end the Ukraine war. How do you think these assets will come into play when official negotiation between Ukraine and Russia starts, particularly concerning land and power plants like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant?
Well, I think that, unfortunately, I feel terrible saying this, but there is not going to be a perfectly moral outcome to this war. And I think we are facing an era where 3 great powers, China and Russia and the United States, are being governed by a policy of realpolitik, kind of exactly the sort of thing that was supported by Otto von Bismarck when he was Chancellor of Germany, which is, this idea that states are not moral actors. They operate to defend their national interests, even, when that involves disregarding, ethical or ideological considerations. I think all three leaders of these countries are prepared to not value things as much as, civil liberties, ideas about national sovereignty as, other leaders have in the past. And I think that Trump's people are sending out signals that they do not expect Russia to give back much, if any, of the territory that it has taken over, about 20% of Ukraine proper. And I think they keep talking about Zelensky needing to be more realistic. I think that Zelensky or whoever ends up being the leader of Ukraine to sign any peace deal will be expected to make significant territorial concessions. Now, who exactly ends up controlling things like the nuclear power plants, I think that remains to be seen. But I think the United States, under the Trump administration, is anxious to have a stake in valuable natural resources of Ukraine.
Yeah, so Cynthia, we've talked a lot about the talks between U.S. and Russia about the war, but I guess the question is where Ukraine fits into these negotiations. Ukrainian President Zelensky has expressed concerns about being excluded from direct negotiations. So realistically, do you foresee Ukraine having a say at all in the peace talks, keeping in mind Trump's relations with Putin?
Well, Ukraine is in Riyadh, and U.S. negotiators are meeting with the Ukrainian delegation. So there is, at least a pretense of Ukraine being involved. But I think it's a very desperate situation for that country's leaders, just because of the numbers. I mean, back in 2023, the World Bank said that it is going to cost over $486 billion to reconstruct Ukraine. Ukraine needs $140 million a day to run, right? It has received $118 billion in aid and loans over the last 3 years. This is not sustainable. And I think that, unfortunately, there is historical precedent for big powers deciding the fate of little powers. For instance, Churchill and Stalin met secretly in October 1944 during the Second World War to sort of talk over the fate of Eastern European countries, and they did a lot of horse trading. It was like, you can take the Baltics if I get Greece kind of thing. And hopefully that is not what happens here, but all of this talk of like realistic results and pragmatism smacks very much of this sort of new idea that, big powers will have more say in determining the shape of Ukraine. Now, Zelensky is trying to counter this by siding closer to Europe, and the European Union, its leaders have been making lots of statements of unequivocal support for Ukraine. But at the same time, and I feel traitorous for even pointing this out, but the European Council just finished meeting last week, and on the table was a $40 billion military aid package to Ukraine, and that was watered down to $5 billion, and even that was not agreed upon without great controversy. So, European leaders are strapped. They're trying to come up with their own sort of, continental defense initiatives, and they're having to sort of, decide how far does their commitment to Ukraine extend. And, and they are also struggling with what is a moral outcome and what is a realistic one.
Yeah, Cynthia, you've briefly alluded to this, but with U.S. support for Ukraine now in doubt, there have been reports that Kyiv's European allies are weighing whether to seize $300 billion in frozen Russian assets to compensate and help with Ukraine's reconstruction. Now, with everything you've mentioned, no moral ending to the war, potential reconstruction costs, Ukraine not projected to have much of a say at the negotiating table. How likely is it that this could happen, and could a move like this violate international law as well as destabilize financial markets?
Well, Russia is interested in securing some kind of peace because Russia is under a certain amount of economic pressure. The country had over 3% growth in 2023 and 2024, but this year it looks like there's going to be stagflation. The government is having to borrow internally because it lacks access to international, lending institutions, and its rainy day fund is going down. It's been operating despite the fact that this $300 billion is frozen. And, and I think it would be outraged if it was just sort of taken away. But I think given Russia's willingness to bring an end to this war, on its terms, of course, but and the European Union's reluctance to take a more confrontational stance. At the end of the day, European countries haven't even agreed to place peacekeeping forces in Ukraine yet. They've been quite cautious in what they are prepared to offer. And I think that especially seeing this sort of new rapprochement between the United States and Russia, there's a wariness about escalation. Unfortunately, I think that this idea of confronting Russia such that Russia withdraws from territory that it has taken from Ukraine, I don't see many people talking about that right now, because I think there's an idea that would only happen if other countries were willing to join Ukraine and to attack Russia. And that's been sort of a hard line since the war began, right? No one wants to risk NATO involvement in an assault on Russia. They don't want to take the war into Russia. And without doing that, Russia's not going to give back the territory that it's already occupied. And I think that there is a growing emphasis on not antagonizing Russia right now and pushing for peace, even if it isn't perfectly just.
All right, Cynthia, before you go, let's look at the road ahead and what's next. So for now, Trump administration officials see the American proposed 30-day ceasefire as a major breakthrough. If this actually happens, what are the next steps? And realistically, how long would it take to get to a full ceasefire?
Well, some Trump administration officials were talking about Easter, which is in a month. I think that that's unrealistic. I also think that looking at Russian media, Sunday's largest news program was talking about how Putin was on the phone with Trump. They agreed to this ceasefire, and within 10 minutes of Putin hanging up the phone, he had ordered Russian forces to shoot down 7 of Russia's own drones that were about to launch attacks on Ukrainian power plants. But, if you look at the media today, Russians are continuing missile strikes into Ukraine. And, and each side is already accusing the other of violating these ceasefire terms, even a limited ceasefire on energy infrastructure. So there's a real uncertainty about how much, conflict can be reduced. But unfortunately, I have a sense that Ukraine is going to be pushed to agree to something that it doesn't want to agree to. And I'm not even sure that Zelensky is going to want to stay in power. I'm not sure he's going to want to be the leader of Ukraine that signs a peace deal that will give Russia 20% of Ukrainian territory.
All right, a lot of moving pieces here, but one thing is clear, uncertainty is high. This conflict is not over, and Ukraine's future is still hanging in the balance. Cynthia, we really appreciate you joining us on the show today. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Yeah, great chat, Cynthia. That was Cynthia Hooper, Associate Professor and Russian and Eastern European Studies Program Advisor at the College of the Holy Cross. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.